evening, class. It is Tuesday evening, and in El Paso, it snowed today, so it's kind of chilly here. It's very unusual for us, especially given we had been in warm weather up till Sunday, and it started to slowly cool down yesterday, and then today it just froze. Um, so I'm hoping that you are in a nice, safe, and warm environment. And so today we're going to be talking about stress. And so this weather might come off as stressful to some people, and other people might enjoy it. And so this statement here on this first slide kind of captures it all. It says, I have a ton of excitement in my life. I used to call it stress, but I feel much better now that I call it excitement. And so the statement kind of explains that we can take a situation and may see it one way and then maybe think about it slightly differently and reevaluate it, reappraise it, and put a positive spin on it. We can have multiple people examining the exact same situation, experiencing the exact same environment, yet they might perceive different levels of stress from that very same exposure to whatever toxic environmental stimuli they might be experiencing. So let's talk about stress and how researchers have conceptualized stress over the years. And so, let me see. Okay, so this is Richard Lazarus, and he is kind of the modern day lead or figure for stress and coping. He kind of defined, he's one of the lead persons who defined the way we conceptualize stress and coping in modern day. But before we get to Richard Lazarus, let's kind of go back in time a little bit first. And so if we look at the history of stress and the way it was defined, the first indicator of stress as a term was identified back in the 14th century, where stress was defined as hardships or straits or diversity or affliction. And then we see a slightly different conceptualization taking place in the 17th century, where stress is now perceived in the context of the physical sciences, such that Robert Hooke talked about stress as being an external force acting on an object or body. Strain was identified as the deformation or distortion of an object or a body. And then in the 20th century, contemporary work on stress begins. And we see that Walter Cannon in 1932 defined stress as a disturbance of homeostasis, or that balance that we try to achieve physiologically and even in other aspects of our lives, right? But mainly physiologically. And so when our physiological balance in all domains is thrown off kilter, that is how stress was being defined back then by Walter Cannon. And they basically defined stress as the stress reaction as one of fight or one of flight. So either you're going to stand up and fight or deal with the situation at hand, or you're going to take flight and try to escape the stressful situation. And so that was kind of the way people envisioned stress back then. And then the more modern day father of stress is Hans Selye, who said that stress was an orchestrated set of bodily defenses against noxious stimuli. And by noxious stimuli, They meant like hormone extracts or toxins or cold or noise or any kind of annoying environmental stimuli. And the set of reactions, the stress reaction, he defined it or called it the general adaptation syndrome. And later, they distinguished between good and bad types of stress. So bad stress was just labeled stress, and new stress, such as like a big event like having a baby or getting married, was called a good type of stress. So then in the 1960s and 1970s, Richard Lazarus kind of redefined stress as a relationship between a person and their environment. And so basically, when the environmental demands are perceived as taxing or exceeding the person's ability to cope with them, that is the very definition of stress. And so just think about that. Your environmental demands, whatever they are, if you perceive them as taxing or exceeding your ability to cope, that is going to cause you to experience stress. Okay? So in the 70s and the 80s, the researchers began investigating chronic and daily exposures to stress. So chronic stressors are just those that persist over time and can affect multiple life roles and eventually erode your personal, social, and material resources that you need to cope with that stress. Then in the 1990s, research started to focus on the negative impacts of stress on the negative health impacts of stress. They started focusing on the negative impacts of childhood exposure to stress on negative health impacts. And so I think most of you are familiar with the term adverse childhood experiences. And so we know that the more adverse childhood experiences a young person has, a child has, the more likely that they are going to experience poor health outcomes later in life. So again, as we go through that history of how the meaning of stress has changed, we realize that it went from being defined as a stimulus or an objective, taking an objective view of what stress was, right? Something that was out there that could be measured. And then over time, stress started to be defined as a response. So your subjective experience of what was going on with the stressor. And then eventually it became more of an interaction between the person and the environment. So again, this led to 3 definitions of stress. Again, the stimulus-based definitions, they focus on what's causing the stress in the environment. So it focuses on the stimuli in the environment, the events that are occurring, situations outside of the individual that can disturb the individual. So the death of a loved one, starting a new job, getting married, COVID-19, right? All of those things are out there and they're impacting the individual. And so changes in life circumstances are certainly potential sources of stress. They can, again, be positive or negative changes. But even when we have a wonderful change like having a baby, it can still be really stressful, especially if we don't have someone guiding us through it or we haven't had a child before and we are dealing with having to meet the needs of this new little baby that is incredibly demanding on our coping resources, right? So in the stimulus-based definition, stress would be defined as a tragic life event, something that happened outside of the individual. Okay, so then we come to the response-based definition. So we focus on the state or the condition of being stressed. And it was typically defined in two ways. When you think of being stressed, what do you think about how you're responding to it? What are two ways that we typically respond? Well, we might feel very anxious, right? We might feel very tense. And so we can describe it emotionally or affectively. We might also experience like physiological signs of stress, such as tension in the body, sweaty hands, a racing heartbeat. So all of those are just examples of stress as a response of the body to toxic stimuli, right? Or major challenges or demands placed on the individual, on the body. Then we come to the third and the current approach to defining stress, which defines stress as an intervening process or a transaction between the individual and the environment, right? And so a large focus is on the cognitive processes that intervene between the stimulus, the environment, and the response, the individual's response. Okay, so something happens, right? If something happens in your environment, we have to conduct an evaluation of that as to whether it's good or bad. And so this focus on cognitive processes are called appraisals. And these appraisals apply meaning to the event with respect to one's well-being. Okay, so for example, stress is the extent to which the demand of a situation exceeds one's ability to cope. Okay, so just think, the stressor, what are the demands of this stressful situation, and what is my capability to cope with those demands, with those challenges, with those threats. Okay, and so this is the transactional definition of stress. Okay, so when we have how we respond to stress after we appraise as the stressor as being within or outside of our ability to cope might result in various types of reactions, of stress reactions, right? It's going to depend how we appraise it. But once we formulate that appraisal, that evaluation as to how demanding and how able we are to cope with the stressor, then we may respond emotionally or affectively. We might respond cognitively or physiologically, like we had just stated earlier, and even behaviorally. Okay, so regarding feelings and emotions, we might feel threatened or nervous or anxious or worried or feel fearful. Or if it's the kind of eustress, like kind of it's stressful, but it's a good stress, we might feel challenged, we might feel hopeful, we might feel relief. So those are all types of emotions that we might be experiencing. And we might be experiencing both the negative and the positive type of emotions, okay? Cognitive reactions. So we are constantly evaluating and reevaluating the situation as we try to cope with it. We evaluate initially, am I in danger? Why did this happen? What could I have done differently, right? You might ruminate on what led to you experiencing the stressor. You might be actively thinking, what can I do to make the situation better? What can I do to eliminate the stressor from my life, right? Then you're going to have those physiological responses that we talked about, the pounding heart, increased blood pressure, sweaty palms, your fingers feel cold when you're stressed. And then you might also have a behavioral reaction. So depending on the situation, if it's an animal charging at you or even a person an unfriendly person coming at you, you might decide to take flight, right? and escape that person or that individual or the situation, whatever it is. Or you might stay and fight and confront the individual, right? So that would be a behavioral example of a reaction to stress. So it also, so stress can also impact our ability to carry out our everyday tasks, whether it be our schoolwork or our work or our ability to take care of our families or whatever the case, right? But when we're really stressed, it might affect all of those levels of behavior. And then, so oftentimes when we have a stressor in our life, we might engage behaviorally also to try to address the stressor and eliminate the stressor, remove the stressor. Okay, so this is basically, according to Lazarus, the stress process. We have an event, a potentially stressful, noxious event that results in an evaluation or a stress appraisal. Is this something threatening to me? Is it putting a lot of demands on my time? And do I have the resources to cope with this threat or demand in my life? Right? And from there, it results in a stress reaction. And we just talked about multi-dimensional types of stress reactions, whether they be physiological or affective or behavioral responses to the stressor, right? Once we appraise it, even our cognitive functioning might be altered, right, as part of our stress reaction. And so then once we kind of experience those initial things, we try to work to reduce the stress. And so we engage in different types of coping. And the type of coping the coping behavior that we engage in might be used to deal with the stress, just the emotional, the affective, the challenging or the threatening situation, right? And that's called emotion-focused coping. And we might also be trying to cope just with how we're feeling, the feelings of stress, those multidimensional aspects of the stress reaction. All of those types of behavioral tendencies to engage in trying to address either the stress appraisal or the stress reaction are what Lazarus called the emotion-focused coping. You might also engage in behavior to try to address and deal with the stressful situation, whatever the event might be. And this is what Lazarus calls problem-focused coping. And so we have the cognitive appraisal process, that evaluation of the situation that's going to help us determine if it's going to be perceived as stressful or not stressful. And so again, the appraisals are evaluations, and we have two types of evaluations that we conduct. It's called two types of appraisals. One is primary and one secondary. The primary one is first trying to identify what the threat in the environment is or what the demands are that are posing a challenge to our ability to cope, right? So basically, what's going on and what is the meaning of it in terms of demands or dangers or threats to my well-being. And then the secondary appraisal is your appraisal or evaluation of whether you can cope with those demands, those dangers, those harms that are being posed by the stressful stimuli. So basically, it's our assessment of our resources to cope, right? And so these two types of appraisals, the primary and secondary appraisal, combine to help define the level of stress. Okay, so stress is defined as the extent to which the situational threats or demands tax or exceed your ability or your resources to cope. That is how stress is defined, okay, using the cognitive appraisal approach. And so now let's talk about different types of coping techniques. So coping refers to either the cognitive or the behavioral efforts to prevent, to manage, or alleviate stress. Okay. And so basically there are two general functions of coping. They can be problem focused or they can be emotion focused. Okay, so two major dimensions of coping, either problem focused or emotion focused. So problem focused coping focuses on altering the stressful situation, either eliminating or addressing, meeting the demands of the stressful situation, right? And thereby you help to regulate all the other stress responses to the situation. The emotion-focused coping dimension focuses on just regulating the emotional part of the stress response. Okay, so problem focus is going to address the stressor. Emotion focus is going to address just focus on regulating your emotions during the stressor without doing anything about the stressor. Okay. So many types of coping have been, coping subtypes have been identified within each of these two domains. So there's various types of problem-focused coping, various types of emotion-focused coping. So let's look at some of those. First, focusing on the problem-focused coping. Here are a few different types. There's more than what I list here. So we have active coping, and that's basically, what we defined early on, taking those active steps to eliminate the stressor. So I took action to try to get rid of the problem, right? There's also planning. It's another type of problem-focused coping. And here it's just the individual thinking about how to deal with the stressor, right? I thought about how best to handle the problem. And then there's instrumental social support seeking. So basically, you're asking for help from another individual to provide some type of instrumental supportive assistance. Okay, so either you might be asking them for advice on how to handle the problem, especially if it's someone who's more experienced or has, has previous experiences with the stressor, or they're more mature than you. You might also ask for financial assistance, or if it's something that is posing high demand on your time, you might ask them to assist in dealing with the demands of the situation. And then there's confrontive coping, and that's basically just aggressive, hostile attempts to change the situation. So I confronted the person in order to change their mind, right? So that they would not be posing the stressor on me. The second domain of coping is emotion-focused coping. And here are some examples. For example, we might reappraise the situation in a positive manner. So trying to view the situation in a more positive light, trying to find that silver lining, right? I looked for something good in what was happening, for example. Then another type of emotion-focused coping is acceptance. And here it's just, trying to accept the reality of the situation. I learned to live with it, whatever if you got divorced, if someone passed away, whatever, someone came to live with you that you're not used to living with. It might be a variety of things, right, that we really can't do anything about, but so we just learn to live with it. Others might engage in denial, which is just basically pretending that there is no problem. No problem exists. And so someone saying, I refuse to believe what happened, right? Others can focus on venting their emotions. And sometimes, just venting, just getting out the words of what's going on with you provides a relief. It's helpful in reducing the degree of stress that you're experiencing. So concentrating on one's feelings and expressing them um, is another type of emotion-focused coping. And then there's emotional social support seeking, right? So you want others to comfort you emotionally. So I talked to someone about how I felt. Okay. And so then this begs the question, which forms of coping are good for you and which are bad? And I can tell you that there is no universally good or bad type of coping. It really depends on the situation, right? So different situations may actually call for emotion-focused coping, while others would really benefit from a more um, uh, active approach to coping, okay? So again, no forms of coping are inherently good or bad. Successful coping depends on many factors, so on the situation itself and what stage in the encounter you're in terms of the presence of the stressor. Okay. Um, so it also depends on the type of situation, right? So is the situation one that you can change for the better? One that you can actually do something about? Or is it a situation that's not controllable? You can't do anything about it, right? So how might we uh, engage in or decide what type of coping to engage in those different types of situations? Okay. So if you can't do anything about it, then maybe emotion-focused coping is better, such as engaging in acceptance or even denial. But if there is something you can do about it, then you should try to engage in some kind of active coping, right? Um, so in that case, acceptance or denial is not okay. So for example, if you're going to have an exam coming up, is that something you can do something about it as a stressor? Can you reduce your stress about the upcoming exam? Well, yeah, you can, right? You can actively cope by studying for the exam, by seeking social support and asking other people to study with you, right? And so in that case, you would not want to engage in denial. Like, yeah, there's, I'm not going to think about the exam right now. I don't even want to think about it, right? Like, that's probably not a good coping strategy. Coping also depends on the stage of the encounter, as we mentioned earlier. So taking an example of a midterm examination again. So the stages of the stressor might be anticipatory in terms of, the stress is coming and, you need to be preparing for the exam. Uh, Especially if you're not sure what's going to be on that exam or what the teacher tests like. Um, then there's the waiting stage, which is also related to stress of the exam, but it occurs after you've completed the exam and you're waiting for your grades to come to you, right? So how might you cope in the waiting stage? And then there's the outcome stage or the final stage of the stressor of the exam, and that's after you learn your grade. And that's whether it might be a good grade or a bad grade, right? So different types of coping that we might examine across these stages are active coping, distancing, and social support seeking. Okay, so let's take a look. So here in this figure, we are looking at the use of the strategy, low use, high use. And then here on the horizontal axis, we are looking at the different types of coping strategies. Okay, so the different stages of the stressor. Okay, whether it's the anticipatory stage of the stressor, the waiting stage, or the outcome stage of that exam, which is the stressor, right? And then the different colored lines are the type of coping that you might engage in. And so in the anticipatory stage, we see that distancing should be relatively low use, right, in the anticipatory stage. You do not want to distance yourself from the stressor. You want to deal with the stressor. You want to engage in active coping by studying for that stressor. You might also seek out social support, just to someone to vent with, or maybe even someone to study with, providing more of an instrumental type of support, or just an emotional support, right? Like, I'm really stressed, I need someone to baby me, or whatever the case, right? And then once you complete the test, you go into the waiting phase of the stressor, till you're waiting for the outcomes. And really, there's not much to do at that point. So there should be low engagement or low use of the active coping strategy and the social support. You're just waiting. And so distancing at this point might be a good type of coping, right, in the waiting stage. And then when we come to the outcome, once you get your grades, again, you might want to engage in low distancing. You're going to have to deal with the grade, right? And then figure out what your next steps are going to be if the grade wasn't so hot. Active coping there flattens out, right? The grade is finalized. The exam is over. The particular stressor of the exam is over. Maybe not the class may not be over, but that particular stressor there is over. So there would be low engagement and distancing, and low engagement and active coping. And at that point, you might be asking for social support, to someone to comfort you if you got a bad grade. Okay, so these are just examples. Okay, so 5 important points about coping. First, coping is contextual, such that coping responses depend on the context within which they occur. So again, how we respond, how we cope is going to depend on the specific situation. And so the coping strategy you use will change from stressful situation to stressful situation. We wouldn't always engage in the same type of coping across different types of stressors, right? The second point is that coping thoughts and actions are separate from their outcomes. So coping does not imply success, okay? So this has 2 implications. Determining successful coping depends on, one, the particular person, right, might evaluate the coping outcomes differently, the type of encounter, the short or the long run of the stressor, and then the outcome of the stressor. A second implication is that no coping efforts are inherently good or bad. Okay, so again, denial, repression, or other types of emotion-focused coping might be beneficial when there's nothing to be done about the stressor, right? Active coping with a situation that cannot be changed is not good, right? You might be going and trying and trying and trying, but there's nothing to be done. And you might end up with frustration and such, and lack of success, right, in coping outcomes, because it's not a modifiable stressor. Okay, so emotion-focused coping with highly threatening and uncontrollable situations might be the most appropriate type of coping. Okay, so I mean, we've already covered this. So disengaging coping strategies can be employed either through distancing, avoidance, whether it be cognitive or behavioral, or just denial that the stressor exists at all. You might also engage in meaning-based strategies, so trying to induce some kind of positive emotion or some kind of positive meaning through cognitive reappraisal. You might also be looking to God to help you interpret the situation. Okay. So active coping should occur when the situation, again, is perceived to be modifiable, mutable. There's something you can do about the stressor. When that's the case, we should engage in active coping. So again, problem-focused coping is the most adaptive because you're taking action to address the stressor, to eliminate the stressor. You might also engage in information seeking and instrumental social support seeking, so we're asking others for assistance in dealing with the stressor. Okay, so the third important point is that in real life situations, people tend to engage in multiple types of coping strategies, not just one single strategy, right? So, for example, one might seek emotional social support just to help deal with one's intrusion of emotion. And they might also engage in active coping strategies such as planning, active coping, and instrumental social support to actually help address the problem. But you might still need a little bit of emotion-focused coping just to help regulate the negative affect associated with the stressor. 4, coping is process-oriented. So during any stressful experience, coping changes from one time to another, right? And so you might appraise the stressor or the situation as stressful and engage in coping. And after you've been coping for a bit, you might reappraise and adjust your coping strategies, okay? And so it keeps going back like in this cycle, right, of reappraising, coping, until the stressor is eliminated. Okay, coping cannot only reduce the negative emotions, but can generate new emotions such as positive emotions, right? So that we might experience relief, right, at the thought of eliminating that stressor. Okay, 5, the fifth point is that people may employ coping responses without even being aware that they're doing so. So their coping strategies may be so habitual, so conditioned or well learned that they don't even realize they're engaging in some kind of coping strategy. Alrighty. So let's see, what do we have here? Oh, so there's also has been some research on coping styles. So just people's individuals' disposition or general tendencies to not only appraise the situation in a certain way, but to respond to stress in a certain way. So interpretation of the stressor or the potentially stressful situation might be affected by these individual traits that differ across people. And it can actually moderate the impact of the stressor on coping processes and outcomes. And it can have direct effects on the outcomes of the stressful situations. So let's look at some coping personalities or coping styles. These are different types of personalities. So here you have the optimist, right? People who are optimistic tend to have generalized positive experiences for outcomes. So being an optimist is found to be a significant predictor of positive physical health across different types of stress outcomes. People who are optimistic also tend to engage in greater active type of coping. Okay. Another personality style is benefit finding. And so this refers to the act of finding benefit in the stressor. And we all know people like this, right? We all know someone who's like a real optimist, like he's always expecting the positive outcomes, or someone who's always looking for the silver lining in the situation. So benefit finding is shown to be associated with positive reappraisal of the situation, which makes sense, right? We're always looking for something positive in what's going on. And it's also associated with active coping. The other coping personality is that person who's the information seeker, right? No matter what the situation, they go in and they do their research to figure out, what's going on and to maybe help them deal with the stressor. And so the research is a little bit mixed here, and it's not totally clear whether information seeking is adaptive for the individual, especially across different types of situations. Okay. The book described distinguish between monitors, so people who engage in a lot of information seeking, versus blunters, those who just don't want to know. It's like, don't tell me, I don't want to know, right? And so when we're working with cancer patients in our studies, sometimes we need to know what their cancer diagnosis and staging is. So what stage cancer do they have? And they do not permit us to find that out, because if we found out, we might let them know what stage of cancer they had, and it would be too stressful for them to know that, especially if it was a more advanced stage. So they decide to not know. They prefer not to know. Right? And we have other people like, why don't you engage in cancer screening? Well, because if I have cancer, I know I'm going to die, so I just would rather not know, right? Like, they don't go and look for information. They think they know what's going to happen, and therefore they don't want to know if they have cancer or not. They don't want to screen for it. The other type of personality is someone who, is another type of coping is social support seeking, right? So we know those people that are always quick to look for assistance somehow or another to help buffer the effects of the stressors, right? And social support, we know, has a positive impact for the most part on health outcomes, because it helps to buffer the stress effects, right? They have identified that social support is particularly effective on health outcomes, especially when the stressor is prolonged or if it's worsening. The research has shown that social support can be harmful when social ties discourage disclosure or give negative support. Okay, so they discourage you from engaging in certain behaviors, for example, that can be harmful to your health as well, right? So the optimist, and then it's a type of coping personality. I would say benefit finding is also, that's more like a style, right? Information seeking and social support are coping styles. Okay, so the book lightly touched on coping and health disparities, and they talked about how social factors such as racism and discrimination are thought to have both direct and indirect effects on health. So clearly racism and discrimination are sources of stress, right? They're noxious stimuli. And they can affect our health indirectly by limiting the jobs that we can get, and therefore might limit our socioeconomic status. They might also affect where we can live, especially if there's segregated communities, right? And then in those indirect ways, they can have an impact on our health. But it can also directly influence health by acting as a stressor that causes lots of physiological effects that are toxic to our bodies, because stress produces all sorts of physiological changes to our immune system, to our endocrine system, to our nervous system. And so all these over the prolonged duration can lead to permanent changes in our physical health. Okay. They just briefly described the John Henryism hypothesis, which posits that certain racial ethnic minority groups, especially this term is applied to Black or African American populations who experience lots of discrimination and racism, but it shows that they are persistent and engage in lots of active coping to get ahead and to survive. But in spite of the continuous demands on certain minority populations, they continue to persevere and actively engage in trying to address the stressors in their life and to get ahead. But this persistence, not that persistence is bad, but the constant effort that they have to put forth might take a toll on one's health. Okay, it's just that they have to work extra hard to have a balanced life, right? Either a successful life or a safe life or whatever the case, right? But the effort that they need to put forth is extreme, and having to put out so much effort, eventually our resources to cope with those situations become taxed. And also the constant impact on our physiology, on our bodies, also becomes taxed, right? And ends up in negative health outcomes. So here's an example of a stress appraisal measure for adolescents. So just some items that are assessing threat and challenge and stress responses or types of coping, right? I have the ability to overcome stress is perceived as a challenging stress appraisal. I perceive stress as threatening, clearly, a threat appraisal of the situation. The R, I think, it accounts or it measures the perceived resources one has. So there is someone I can turn to for help. So clearly they have those type of social support, instrumental social support to help them out during the stressor. And so you can read through the others and know which ones are challenge type of appraisals, threat appraisals, and even evaluation of the resources one has to cope. Here's another measurement tool. This is the cognitive appraisal of stress scale. And so in this scale, you would evaluate how threatening the event is, and then you would evaluate how able you are to cope with it. Okay, so it has two evaluations: the primary appraisal of demand or threat, the secondary appraisal of coping ability. Okay, so your credit card is turned down in a store. How threatening would such an event be to you? And how able would you be to deal with that situation? Okay. Police pulls you over for speeding. Again, how threatening is that to you? And how able are you to deal with it, to cope with it? Okay, there's also those assessments of those personality coping styles or coping personalities. This one is the life-oriented test. It's a revised version of the original, and it measures differences in individual differences in optimism versus pessimism. And so the instructions for this are simply to be as honest and accurate as one can throughout the survey, and try not to let a response to one item influence the response to the other item. And clearly we want to let people know that there are no correct or incorrect responses. And so the type of items here would be, in certain times, I usually expect the best. Or if something can go wrong for me, it will. I'm always optimistic about my future. And so you can either reverse code the negative ones to get an indicator of optimism, or you can reverse code the positive ones to the optimistic items to get an indication of how much of a pessimist the individual is, right? And these are usually rated on a Likert type scale, like a 5-point scale, right? From strongly agree or strongly disagree. There are also measures of the way people cope. Here we have the brief cope, which is a short version that kind of captures some of the emotion focused type of coping versus the action or active type of coping. Okay, problem focused coping. So I've been turning to work or other activities to take my mind off things, right? So you want to distract yourself, the things being the stressor. I've been concentrating my efforts on doing something about the situation I'm in. So that is a clear indicator of a problem focused, whereas the first one is more of an indicator of an emotion focused type of coping. Okay. I've been saying to myself, this isn't real. Again, emotion focused and so on. Okay. Again, the response scales are a 4-point for this brief cope that we just looked at, and it ranges from 1 to 4, where 1 indicates I haven't been doing this at all to 4, I've been doing this a lot. Okay, so that kind of covers the chapters from the textbook and also from the Lazarus article. There's lots of information there that might have been redundant. But I wanted to kind of give you also an example of how stress theory is used in trying to modify behavior. And so this study, well, first of all, the way stress is typically studied is that a lot of our stress research focuses on college students because they are a readily available group of students. And often they have to participate in research in order to get credit for their one of their classes. So they have to participate in so many studies. But a typical stress study would mimic a potentially stressful encounter, such as, different types of stressors that they use in psychology laboratories are like having people count backward by 7, starting with a large number, and then you just observe them. You observe what's going on with them, and they know they're being observed, and so people get nervous and start miscounting, or it just produces anxiety in folks. Because we tell them to start counting backwards by 7 as quickly as you can, right? As quickly and accurately as you can. And just that alone, that type of instruction will put stress on an individual. Another type of stressor has been, another common stressor used in psychology laboratories is to have people develop a speech and perform it, right? So here's the topic. It's like, you give them like a potentially controversial topic. So like one that I remember from one of my classes was, um, you encountered a politician recently who suggested that anyone living in the United States should be able to speak English. Prepare a 3-minute speech as to why you agree or disagree with the statement. And then you're going to prepare it, and then we're going to give you time to present it to us. And so that can be really, really stressful, right? Like, what? I have to, nobody likes public speaking. So performing a speech can be quite stressful for some people, not for everyone, right? So different people will perceive that situation differently, would appraise it differently, right? And so typically they would hook up the college students to some physiological equipment that measures their physiological response to the stressor. Um, and typically they would have the participants sit down for a baseline or a rest period before they are given the stress activity instructions. And then they get the instructions for the upcoming stress task, so whether it be mental arithmetic or performing a speech. And then after they receive the instructions to the stress task, they're asked to appraise the situation as a stressor. So this is before they even have to perform the stressor. Um, they're gonna be asked to appraise and give a primary appraisal to assess how threatening or demanding the situation is. And then they typically engage in a secondary appraisal, assessing their ability to cope with it, right? Like, oh, it's not a problem. I can cope with this. I can count backwards perfectly fine. Or no, I can't stand to speak in public. I don't want to give the speech. It's so stressful for me, right? So I don't have the ability to give a good speech. And so you can see how those appraisals, both the primary and the secondary appraisal, might vary quite a bit between people. And so then they would have the participant perform the task for about 4 minutes. It's usually a short, stressful task. And then as they're performing the task, they would measure the physiological reactions. And then immediately after the task, they would measure how much stress they experienced, their subjective stress levels, what emotions they experienced during the stressor. And then they would also assess how well they performed during the stressor, because we know that stress can affect our performance in a variety of tasks. Okay, so that's a typical experiment. But now they wanted to take kind of this model of the stressful encounter they wanted to use this model, kind of trying to impose threat and challenge appraisals in regard to asking individuals or trying to get people to engage in specific behaviors. And so then the article you read this week was examining patterns of cognitive appraisal. The research, I already went all of this, but the research, in the research, they typically try to manipulate how people are going to appraise the situation, whether it be as a primary appraisal or a secondary appraisal, or just look at individual differences and then look at how their affective and physiological and cognitive and all types of responses differ across the threat and challenge type of appraisals. So Schneider et al. In the article you read this week wanted to apply this biobehavioral model of persuasion. And so they used the biopsychosocial model of threat and challenge, which was developed by, which was further defined by Blaskovich and Tomaka. So you might recognize the name Tomaka, and that is our graduate program coordinator. And so he's very well known for his research on threat and challenge. But they wanted to they wanted to see if they could manipulate messaging appeal through highlighting the threat or challenge in the messaging toward a health condition and the required health behavior. And so they recognized, given past research that they were examining, and that in order for a message to be appealing and effective in changing behavior, that it needed to elicit some kind of emotional arousal. And so it needed to promote the right level of risk or vulnerability to negative outcomes, right? Whatever the negative outcome. In our case, it's usually, in public health, we're usually talking about negative outcomes related to health outcomes, right? And so wanted to promote the right level of vulnerability to negative outcomes. In this case, we wanted to promote a certain level of stress or arousal, right, in terms of the potential to experience those negative outcomes. However, they didn't want to do it so extremely, whereas they would make the individual feel too vulnerable to the negative health outcomes. And because that would maybe give this sense that the negative outcomes are inescapable, right, that they cannot be avoided. And so that might lead to an overwhelming sense of doom. And they talk a little bit about why fear tactics are often not successful, because they might produce this type of response to, like, excessive threat might feel like there's just nothing to be done about it. But again, there does need to be some kind of vulnerability or threat to the health outcome that needs to result or be aroused in order to motivate change. So just like with the health belief model, if we don't promote a combined high perceived susceptibility with a high perceived severity, which equals to threat, right, it's unlikely we're going to motivate behavior. It's the same concept here. They also said or suggested, based on the literature that they presented, that an effective message appeal would need to promote perceptions of self-efficacy to engage in the behavior that we're trying to promote, and that we would provide them, the messaging would provide them with the needed resources to carry out that behavior or that coping strategy. And so basically, you would provide information on how to manage the threat effectively. And in this study, they were looking at a disease, right, a fake disease, and they wanted to make sure, they wanted to encourage students, or they wanted to increase the likelihood that they would go get screened for this disease. Okay, so if the person doesn't perceive the efficacy to go get screened, then they're not going to adhere to screening, right? And they're just going to act in avoidance of it. Okay, so how did they manipulate arousal and self-efficacy? So those were the independent variables that they were manipulating in their study. First, they wanted to manipulate arousal by increasing, by providing a threat message, right, that would result in a threat appraisal, and then maybe an avoidant type of coping strategies. They also wanted to create a challenge-oriented message, right, where, remember, challenges where people perceive demands, but relative to their coping strategy, but the coping strategies are usually sufficient to address the demands or the threat of the situation. So they wanted a message with that kind of balance in it, so that the individual would appraise a challenge in carrying out the behavior, so that they would engage in approach tendencies or actually engage in the desired behavior. So in study one, they engaged in health communication manipulations that were altered um, by, uh, by modifying the level of personal concern or worry around the illness of an imaginary illness, right, called electrolysis, that they made up for the students. And so they wanted some students to experience high worry about their ability to get the disease, and then also lots of worry over like the negative consequences of getting the disease. And so their messaging was set up to promote high worry by telling the students that it was very highly contagious and it had very negative consequences, and in many cases could result in possible death. Right? So they were trying to promote the threat of, of the messaging, right? The threatening um, content of the messaging. And then to help kind of reinforce the threat of the disease, they had the students in that particular group write about the impact of the illness, that the illness would have on their life if they were to get it. In the low worry group, they manipulated the messaging by just saying that it's contagious. There might be some consequences, but relatively few people die from it. So kind of trying to lower the threat, right? Regarding efficacy beliefs, they simply described that there was a test or a screening available, and that this test tended to be either very reliable or not reliable at all, right? So high or low reliability of the screening test. And so this was the intervention design. So they had a high and low level of a self-efficacy manipulation, and then they had a high and low level of a worry manipulation. So in the condition where they manipulated low worry, but so low worry, but a high level of self-efficacy. So there is some worry, but very high self-efficacy. So low demands, high coping ability. So they thought this would be kind of result in challenge-like appraisals. And then in the condition where there was very high worry, but low self-efficacy promoted, they thought that one would be result in threat type of appraisals, and again, a whole pattern of threat responding. So what did they measure? Again, they did measure the cognitive appraisals, and then they also took some physiological measures, largely focusing on blood pressure, and then they examined the behavior, okay? The desirable behavior of going to get screened for the disease, for that illness. And so regarding cognitive appraisals, the worry ratings were measured relative to the coping or self-efficacy to prevent illness through screening. And so then they found that people who had low appraisal ratios, indicating high challenging appraisals. Okay, so they took the ratio of the perceived demand to the perceived coping ability. So when you had high demand, demand, but lots of coping ability, the ratio would be low, resulting in high challenge appraisals, okay? And when the appraisal ratios consisted of lots of worry, but low ability to cope or low self-efficacy to prevent illness, then that resulted in greater threat appraisals. So again, higher ratios. So overall, in terms of cognitive appraisal ratios, the challenge condition that they set up demonstrated lower appraisal ratios, right? So even though they designed the condition to be challenging, they weren't sure that people would appraise it as a challenge. But in fact, they did. That's all that means, okay? And those folks who were in the threatened condition were less likely to appraise challenge appraisals. Okay, so for the physiological measures, they found that the threat condition, again, the threat condition was the high worry, low self-efficacy. They found that that condition resulted in the highest levels of systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And then regarding behavior, those people who were in the threat condition were less likely to set the screening appointment compared to those folks in the challenge condition, right? So the challenge messaging was actually really good for trying to promote behavior change. Recall the challenge condition does promote some type of arousal, although it's low, right? It does tell them this is a disease, it is contagious, but not a lot of people die from it, right? So there's some arousal that, yeah, it's contagious. You can get exposed to it. It has some consequences, but people don't die, right? So it's a certain level of arousal or anxiety compared to the other folks who are like, it's very contagious. People are dying from it, and the consequences are severe, right? That person might be more anxious over getting the disease, more threatened by getting the disease. And then partner with low self-efficacy to do anything about it or to have a reliable test to tell you if you have it. That just promoted some kind of threat condition, okay? So the challenge, low arousal or moderate arousal with lots of self-efficacy, the threat condition, high arousal or high threat paired with low self-efficacy, right? So that's how the messaging combinations were paired. And when it was paired in a challenging way, those people were more likely to report that they set a screening appointment, even though the disease didn't exist. And they did assess whether the students believed the disease was real. And so those people that said that, no, we know this is bogus, and it was usually a small percentage of the students, but they were removed from the final data analysis if they said that they didn't believe that the disorder was real. Okay. So they ran a second study, and this time they added another dimension to their manipulation, to their independent variable. And so they still did the high and low worry. They still did conditions where there was they were promoting high self-efficacy and low self-efficacy. But then they did a third condition or a third dimension of the intervention, whether they had a brief prolonged exposure to the stressor, to the information. Okay. So either they experienced or heard about the infectious disease once, which would be the brief condition, or they heard about it one time in a very brief sort of way, and then they took a little break, and then they were exposed to it again, to the disease and all its potential consequences, but in a more prolonged way, a more extensive way. Okay, so now we have high and low levels of worry manipulation, high and low levels of self-efficacy manipulation, and then high and low levels of exposure to the messaging, the worry messaging, okay? So they measured a few more things in the second study. So they still did the cognitive appraisals, but in this one, they measured emotional responses to the messaging. They measured physiological responses, but this time they focused more on cardiac output and vascular resistance, or what they call cardiovascular reactivity, the combination of those two things. They also measured the behavioral intentions that to get tested. And then also they measured the actual behavior. Their behavioral outcome was that the person would pick out a card that would instruct them where to go get screened, right? So in this study, when they manipulated the condition that consisted of challenging, no, sorry, the condition that manipulated a threat appeal in the messaging, which means they had high worry, low self-efficacy. Those folks demonstrated greater appraisal ratios or greater threat appraisal ratios, right? So just because you define your condition as being threatening might not be perceived as threatening in reality, but they found that the students, in fact, did perceive it as threatening. And so that first measure was just to make sure, it was just kind of a check to make sure that the manipulation was effective. Then in terms of responses to the messaging and the whole process, they measured affect. So they found that greater positive affect or positive emotions were rated by students in the challenging condition or the challenge condition, and positive emotions were rated the lowest in the threat condition. Regarding negative emotions or negative affect, there were no differences between the threat and challenge groups. Okay, regarding cardiovascular reactivity, the challenge condition actually resulted in what researchers have identified as a challenge pattern of cardiovascular reactivity, which consists of high cardiac output and low vascular resistance, so that your vasculature dilates and your heart is pumping harder to get the blood to the different parts of the body that need it to engage in action, right? And so this type of response, a physiological response, is similar to that you would see in somebody who's exercising, and it's considered to be beneficial type of physiological response when coping with stressors. The threat condition, in contrast, had the threat pattern of response, which is considered to be unhealthy. And this is still consists of high cardiac output. But in this case, your vasculature, your blood vessels constrict. And so increasing pressure as the heart is trying to pump out more blood, but the vasculature is not really permitting the flow, the throughput of all the blood throughout the body. Okay, and that increases blood pressure and all sorts of potential negative outcomes. The intentions to get tested were highest in the challenge condition, especially when the messaging was prolonged. Okay, the worry messaging was prolonged. So they had like a double dose of the messaging that would induce worry, even though the worry in that condition, in the challenge condition, was low. Let's see, behavior-wise, they found that the threat condition had fewer people picking up the cards to go get screened, that gave them instructions where to get screened, compared to those people in the challenging condition. Okay, so you can see how they try to apply threat and challenge in their messaging to get people to respond in the desirable way, in this case, to go get screened, right? But as I was reading through this article, it was really making me think a lot about COVID-19 and, the perception of the risk to COVID, right? And how that could be manipulated or enhanced in a positive way that will cause people to engage in safe behavior, to engage people in social distancing and wearing of the masks, right, when they're out in public, to stay home as much as possible. So you can see how this type of messaging might have a great deal of utility in trying to get people to respond appropriately during this pandemic. I thought it was really neat. And I kept thinking, how can we do an intervention kind of translating some of this, but to the COVID-19 situation. So threat and challenge. So that's a potential approach to an intervention that you might want to target. What else was I going to tell you? So the conclusion of the study was really that message designers should develop messages that include challenge messaging, which means that it includes a presentation of the potential health threat, but at a moderate level, right? Not so extreme that the person's going to be turned off by it and want to shut down to it. What's the level of arousal in so many people who are not engaging in wearing masks or not engaging in social distancing, right? The messaging also has to present actions that people can take to manage the health threat. So clearly telling people where they can get masks for free, right? Telling people, how to measure visibly that they are 6 feet apart from the person ahead of them or next to them, right? Just giving people the tools to understand and how to implement those protective behaviors. Where to go to get screened for COVID-19 if they think they've been exposed, right? And if they think they've been exposed, like to give them the information to know how to stay quarantined and for how long. Okay, so things like the messaging is out there, but perhaps the threatening nature of the messaging might be an issue in our communities, right? Anyway, so that's the lecture for this week. I've heard from a few of you on the behaviors that you're going to target in your the behaviors and the populations that you're planning to target, and the potential health outcome, the threatening health outcome that may result if folks don't engage in your targeted behavior, or if they engage in too much of the risky behavior, right? And so I think where people struggle the most is with the behavior. And so trying to define a specific behavior, I think, is sometimes a little bit challenging. And so when you're trying to think of your behavior, I guess one tip that I want to give you is to think about how would you measure that behavior, right? So if you're defining healthy eating, okay, so that's a really broad category of healthy eating, can be defined in a variety of ways with a variety of specific behaviors, right? So think about what specific behavior could you use that you could easily measure. Numbers of fruits and vegetables, reduction in carbs. So you would have people counting carbs or counting calories, right? So that might be the specific. Reduction in fat content. I don't know. It could be a variety of things. But when you think about the behavior you want to propose in your study, think of something that can be measured. Okay? All right. So I hope you all have a good week. Have a good, happy Halloween. And I want to leave you with my puppies that we dressed up for Halloween. And so these are our 3 puppies. And on the left here is Frida. That's her actual name. So we dressed her up like Frida Kahlo, who's an artist, a Mexican artist. And then we have Eleanor is our Old English sheepdog. And her name's Eleanor, so we kind of dressed her up like Eleanor Roosevelt. And our little dachshund, his name is Mr. Big, so we dressed him up like Mr. Big from Sex and the City. So that's how we kill time here at our home during the pandemic. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and send me any more questions regarding your projects that are coming due in the near future. Okay, so take care. Bye-bye.